Hey everybody, just thought it was a nice day to do a little fishing. It's beautiful out. Hopefully you'll get some time to go out today. I think optimally what I'd like to do is actually have class outside once it gets consistently good. The only problem is I'm not sure my neighbors are going to want to hear me lecture about perceptual psychology, but hey, probably good for them, right? Anyway, hope you're doing well, everybody. Couple of quick things. First of all, geez, I've been enjoying meeting with you folks. We've been having a good time, haven't we? But that's the good news. The bad news is we've been having maybe too good a time. And what I mean by that is I am going a little bit slower than I usually go for a class like this. And so I'm going to have to speed up just a tiny bit. That doesn't mean we're not going to do fun stuff, but it means that I'm probably going to, talk a little bit faster than I have been. But, it shouldn't be a problem for you folks. There's, all this information in your book. And certainly you can, rewatch everything because it's being videotaped. I just want you to know that as we go through today, you might see me going a little faster than I've been going. You shouldn't have a problem with it. And of course, the other thing is the exam will be coming up a week from Tuesday. I'll talk much more about that next week. But it'll probably be between 60 and 70 questions. You'll be given the entire class time to do it. And it shouldn't be a problem at all. I think you'll have a very good sense of what the questions will be like. Okay, I'll talk much more about that next week. It'll be a week from Tuesday. All your discussion section material will be on the exam. There will be material in the book that goes beyond the discussion section and the lectures that will be on the exam. But hopefully it will be very straightforward for you. Somebody just asked about a Scantron form. Nope, you're going to be taking the exam right online, right on iLearn, and we'll give you instructions on how to do that. It's actually a very simple way to take an exam for you folks, as it turns out. So you'll be taking it right there in the comfort of your own bedrooms, and you'll be doing it right on iLearn, and you'll see how it kind of does a kind of proctoring for you, but it's very low key. No problem. Okay, so let's just continue what we were talking about last class, and that was music. We're going to finish discussing music today and get into one of our favorite topics, which is smell. People love talking about smell. You'll see there's a lot of really interesting things that go on with smell. Hey, it looks like I can change my hat before I get rid of this. Let's see. No, maybe not. That's a nice hat, though. Uh-oh, there's my bald head behind it. Okay, we'll leave the hat on. Actually, let's go ahead and clear this stuff up and start our discussion for today. So, okay, there I am in all my bald glory. Let's go ahead and talk about music. I'll share my screen. And I think I got the sound to work again. I don't know what happened last time. it was an odd thing that everything just stopped working, but I just tried it out now and it seems to be working okay. And I really just want you to hear one thing, because people have been asking about this, and that's musical metaphor. So we've been through this slide, right? We talked about, remember, the big picture here, and this is something I want to continue to convey, is that the new research on music perception suggests that expertise comes not just from learning about music in music school, about music lessons. You don't need to take an instrument to become an expert listener. Just by virtue of listening to music, as a kind of a way of relaxing through, your 18, 19, 20 years of life, have made you a music expert when it comes to listening. And a lot of this research is showing that as long as you ask the questions in the right way, you ask subjects to kind of associate intervals with, songs they know, that type of thing, it reveals that we all have this expertise. And then we talked about how we can pick out variations that are associated with themes of musical structure, even if those even if the style of music is weird, like when we talk about atonal music. And most importantly, of course, is the way we kind of interpret music emotionally. That's how it really affects us. That's how we really, kind of enjoy music. And we talked about how kind of expert we are at being able to recognize what's being conveyed emotionally in a piece of music, even if there's no lyrics to it, even if it's orchestral music. But then we talked about musical metaphor, and that's just what I want to talk about very quickly. And the idea is that music can do more than just convey emotion. It can convey, things about the way we move, things about action that's occurring, and that's been supported by the idea that we can, associate pieces of music with different scenes in a movie the way they were meant to be associated, even if we've never seen the movie before and never heard the music before. We know what goes together. And one of the best examples, I think, of this is a very old piece of music by Tchaikovsky called Peter and the Wolf. And what I'm going to do is just play the beginning of that piece for you. It was actually written for children to understand and learn about the instruments in the orchestra. But as you're going to see, the way Tchaikovsky actually composed the piece was for musical metaphor, for the instruments to take on a symbolic value in the story that's being conveyed of this young boy trying to protect him and his family and his animal friends from a predatory wolf. So hopefully this will work today.
My dear children, each character of this tale is represented by a corresponding instrument in the orchestra. The bird by a flute. The duck by a ho-ho. The cat by a clarinet staccato in a low register. The grandfather by a bassoon. The wolf by three horns. Peter by the string quartet.
Okay, that's enough probably. And I think that this is just a great example of musical metaphor. That is how it was written, especially for this idea that animals can be represented by different types of music. And sometimes it's very self-evident, right? So of course, birds are going to be represented by a flute. But think about some of the other animals, right? The cat, for example. And maybe the oboe sounds a little like a meow or something like that. But more than that, I think that you can almost hear how the music is portraying how the cat moves, right? Kind of like stalking a little bit, kind of, moving in the cat-like way. And maybe the most kind of striking evidence of this is the theme of the boy, Peter, versus his grandfather. And for Peter's music, which is what you just heard, you heard it kind of, I don't know, kind of floating, kind of carefree, where his grandfather was represented by a bassoon, and the bassoon does have a lower register. It is a lower sound, so that probably does, kind of represent him being older and certainly having a lower voice. But the way the music is actually kind of laid out, it's almost as if it's moving in a slower way and a less smooth way, like somebody who's older might not have the same sort of, gait as they're moving. They might have a little limp or move a little bit more effortfully. And that distinction just comes right out at us, even if we're not conscious of it. It really does a wonderful job of conveying these sort of things. And again, this is something that your brain is really, really sensitive to, can pick up very easily. Research has shown this sort of thing. So music conveys much more than just emotion. It can convey the type of actions that different characters would go through. It seems like something that we're all very, very sensitive to, which is just amazing. It's one of my favorite aspects of music. Also, I should say this happens more than just in orchestral music that's written for this purpose. This can certainly occur in pop music, and maybe you can think of some of your favorite songs, maybe even, not necessarily even with melodies, rap songs where the beat, the background music conveys in some way what the lyrics are conveying. So if it's a love song that's a rap song, the background music is probably a little bit more languid, probably a little bit smooth. If it's something that's a little bit more aggressive in the lyrics, the music probably does that as well. And you've probably noticed that before. But if you listen now, when you go back, you might realize that whether or not it's something that the composer, the producer is doing intentionally, it comes through. It comes through in the way the music and lyrics go together beautifully. The other example here is I have Somewhere Over the Rainbow, and I've already mentioned this. I think this is a really terrific example, very simple example. Remember, I won't get out my guitar today, but remember the melody of Somewhere Over the Rainbow starts with the largest possible expanse of notes across a musical scale. It's called that octave. Remember, you learned octave versus minor versus major intervals last week. With the octave, it is, as I said, the largest span of notes within a musical scale. And so it's somewhere, that's an octave jump. Somewhere. And that, I think, whether it was intentional or not, really beautifully represents the expanse of a rainbow, which is one of the reasons I think that song is so effective. It's one of the most popular songs, in the world. And I think one of the reasons is because it really kind of, the musical notes that were chosen for the melody represent that kind of longing and kind of looking out to the far distance, both in terms of emotion and desire for a different type of life, as well as for the rainbow. And this is something that's always being conveyed in music that we're always picking up, whether it's conscious or unconscious. I just think that's some of the coolest stuff about music. Okay, so let's just finish up our discussion of music by talking about the fact that this is something that you've been doing probably before you were born. How do we know this? Because we have a sense that when you were in the womb, when you were in your mommy's bellies, that in fact, oops, sorry about this. Uh-oh, hold on, yep. Okay, there we go. That you were able to hear music. And what do I mean by that? Well, a number of studies. I'm laughing because this is something I did when my children were in the womb. They played music to infants while they're in utero, and continued to play the same piece over and over again. Okay, you're gonna laugh, but the piece I played to my kids was "Smoke on the Water," just because it was such a simple piece. And so I would, play the intervals, the vocals. I think I even played the recording a couple of times, much to my wife's dismay. And when the children then were born, when those same melodies were played to the children, they seemed to react in a way that showed attention, much more so than when other melodies were played. Which is pretty amazing. So in other words, the music that was played to the children when they were in utero, when they were in the womb, was something that they remembered based on, how we measure attention in infants. This is, typically measured through either pacifier sucking or, attentive head movements or something like that. They showed more attention when they heard the same piece of music that they had heard in the womb, which is really cool. And the other thing I wanted to say about when you were a baby listening to music is something that we're going to see as a theme that is going to be maintained through a number of different parts of this course. And that is, in a way, when you were a baby, you had super perceptual powers that you then kind of lost as you went through childhood. And this is what I mean by that. When you were a baby, you were born into a culture, a language culture, and a musical culture that then kind of fine-tuned your sensitivity to different styles of music. But before that fine-tuning, you were born with abilities to detect all types of music across all types of culture and know something, it's amazing, know something about when there was a musical mistake in that musical form. So let me get this down. So infants, before they're 1.5, can detect mistakes from more musical cultures than can adults. So let me show you what I mean by this. This is a very simple piece of music that's kind of indicative of very simple Western harmonies. I'm just pulled up an example of this. Hopefully you're hearing that. Now, there were no mistakes in that, but if there was a mistake in that, if somebody had if the pianist had hit a wrong note, or they had slowed down in tempo because they were having trouble playing the piece, you would notice, say, oh, that wasn't perfectly played. And infants would notice too, regardless of whether they grew up in a Western musical culture or Eastern, like if they grew up in India or something like that. Both of those infants, before they were 1, would be able to pick out that mistake. Adult Indian listeners would have trouble picking out mistakes in a Western melody if it's the only type of music that they grew up with, was their own Indian music. Versus this type of music, which is an Indian raga piece. Boy, whenever I hear that, I get hungry for Indian food. It's really interesting. I love Indian food, and they play this type of music at the restaurants I go to, so it has that association. But here's the thing. I probably wouldn't know if the sitar player had made a mistake in that piece we were just listening to. I probably wouldn't know if they made a mistake, they hit a wrong note, maybe the tempo wasn't as consistent, it wasn't as uniform as it should be. But when I was an infant, I could. Okay? So infants are kind of super listeners when it comes to music. They are sensitive to kind of the nuances of musical forms that exist beyond their musical culture, which is really interesting. Now, I started talking about this by saying this is a theme we're going to see in other parts of the course where babies seem to show some super perceptual abilities. And we're going to see this, for example, when it comes to speech, which you may have learned about before along the way, but also faces. So you might have heard maybe in other classes, biology, maybe under or high school classes, that when we're born, we are sensitive to the speech sounds of all languages. And then by the time we're 1.5, we kind of narrow what we're sensitive to and lose our ability, okay, to be sensitive to other cultures' speech sounds. Okay, so the class. I'll talk about this when we talk about speech. But the classic example is for Japanese adults. They have trouble hearing the distinction between R's and L's in English. Okay, but Japanese babies can make that distinction, and they lose that ability as they grow into their toddlerhood, which is interesting. And the same is true of faces, and that's a great example. But I'm going to save that until we talk about faces. Turns out, well, that we're sensitive to faces of other species more so when we're infants than by the time we hit toddlerhood. But I'll talk about the details of that later. But that's kind of the big picture on this, that when we're born, we seem to have these open brains that are sensitive to different musical cultures, different language cultures, different visual cultures in terms of face perception. But then that gets narrowed as our culture kind of fine tunes our brain. So we lose that kind of generalized ability by the time we're 1 or 2 or something like that. Okay, we'll talk more about that when we talk about speech and faces. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and I can't remember if this is actually in the book. It might not have made it. It actually is going to diverge a little bit from the main theme of what we've discussed in the class, which is that, regardless of whether you've been professionally trained or you've taken lessons, you're able to be an expert listener. Now we're going to talk about actually people who have had some training. And the reason I want to talk about this is because, well, first, I think it's an interesting set of data, because I know some of you have had some musical training, so this is relevant to you. But it also is something I want to make sure I convey, because music is so important to me, and I believe that it goes that one's kind of understanding and appreciation for music has things that bear on other sorts of cognitive skill. It has advantage for other sorts of cognitive skills. So it's almost a little advertisement for, hey, when you have your kids, let them appreciate music, push them into a few music lessons. It's going to have long-term effects on their cognitive health. So musicians, in fact, do have better hearing when it comes to noisy backgrounds. Now, these are not even professional musicians. These are musicians like me who, has just continued to play music into my adult life. My ability based on research, to hear speech like in a noisy restaurant, at a party, that sort of thing, is a little bit better than non-musicians by virtue of me having this, experience being a listener, an analytical listener to music. That's what kind of, musicianship brings to listening. It allows there to be not just kind of an emotional and metaphorical appreciation for music, but also kind of an analytical appreciation of music, which then generalizes to speech perception as well. And it probably generalizes in one form in that it allows for what's called a greater auditory working memory. In other words, because I have a memory that's been developed as an amateur musician to remember melodies if I'm performing or if I'm just kind of listening in an analytical way to music that's on a streaming service or something like that. What that does is that, again, generalizes past music and actually helps me kind of remember speech that would be conveyed with some sort of noisy background or something like that. So my ability to hear speech in a noisy background, because I'm a musician, is probably partly related to me being able to hold in my memory, my what's called short-term memory, working memory, a little bit more auditory information than somebody who's not a musician. And when it comes to older musicians, I guess like me, I have better functional hearing. And what that means is that, again, it is related to speech, but also when it comes to non-speech sounds, that that we all lose a little bit of our hearing as we get older. Um, kind of our, the nerve cells in our ears kind of start fading a little bit. But my ability to compensate for that sensory loss is a little bit better than somebody who doesn't have some experience with music. So yes, we all lose hearing as we get older, some more than others. But and there's generally a memory decline in both groups. But when it comes again to hearing speech and noise, or from making out melodies that are either played quickly or in a background noise, musicians, even amateur musicians like myself, do have a little bit of advantage. And that comes again from this analytical ability to be able to pick out instruments in an orchestra, to be able to listen to, as I'm listening to popular music now that my kids are listening to, I can pick out the individual instruments without a problem. And that ability, again, generalizes past music and also affects non-musical listening. It also affects non-musical cognition. So you do find people that learn to read music do often have better kind of abstract skills when it comes to mathematics and things like that. Most of what I've been talking about actually pertains, on this slide, most of it pertains to musicians that never even bothered to learn to read music. They just kind of continue to play music, by looking at chords and values and stuff like that. This is never being able to read music, but certainly if you're able to read music, it does generalize beyond what even I'm talking about on these slides. So yes, we are expert listeners, but that expertise with music, if in fact you do a little, kind of sustained practice through your lifetime and learn to read, goes well beyond music and kind of does improve your general cognitive skill. Okay, that's it for music. I'm going to switch to smelling now, but before we do, let's go ahead and maybe do a question or so and see if there's any questions from you folks. Okay. Yes. Okay. So somebody asked, did Bob Mitchell ever make mistakes during the silent movie, given the fact that he was had to watch the movie while playing the organ? Yeah. So I actually, I felt very lucky. I was able to take my whole family and go watch Bob Mitchell perform with a silent movie. Mistake, I mean, it wasn't really mistakes. I mean, you could hear, I was listening much more than I was watching the movie. And I could hear him sometimes kind of just play things very quietly as he was trying to see what the next scene was going to convey. So I could kind of, hear him kind of quietly wait for the action. But no, once he had a sense of the action, whether it was a pirate movie, and there were sword fights and stuff like that, once he had a sense of the action, he was there. He was absolutely attentive to it. And he was in his late 80s at this point. And he was able to convey the information really, really well. If it was a love scene, he got the, kind of the more languid chords out beautifully. It was just, I wouldn't say they were mistakes. I would say that they were understandable kind of pauses. Although he would continue to play music, they would be kind of pauses between scenes until he knew what scene was occurring. He had never seen the movie before that we were watching him perform with. So yeah, that's what happened. Oh, what a great question from I guess Yana. Do people that dance also have this hearing advantage, the ones that musicians have? I think it depends on the expertise with dance. It's a great question. I don't have a full answer for you because I didn't study that when I was writing the book, but I can tell you that people who dance do show certain sensitivities to musical rhythms that non-dancers do. But does it actually affect things like listening to speech in a background of noise, I would imagine that a serious dancer who has to maybe do choreography, so that's kind of developing the dance to follow the music, because they are doing analytical listening. They are listening very closely to the sounds of the music, the different kind of instruments, the different melodic parts that they in fact might be able to take advantage of that listening skill to help their speech and noise and that sort of thing. The only reason this question occurred to me is because I know that dancers have to listen to distinct beats and melodies. Yes, so I think that's a great question, and I think that's my intuition too. I don't know of research on dancers' ability to generalize their musical listening skills, but I think any analytic musical listener, where someone knows music well enough to kind of decipher the parts a little bit, probably add to that ability to do speech and noise. Other questions about music before we do a quick poll question and then go into sniffing? Anything else? All right, then let's do a quick poll question and then we'll go into sniffing. Yes. Okay, this question has to do with implicit musical skills. So this is not about expert musicians. This is about all of us as listeners. And the question is, which of the following are implicit musical skills that most of us have? Ability to implicitly recognize many musical intervals, ability to recognize musical styles like Baroque Romantic in their historical order, ability to implicitly recognize the rules of atonal 12-tone music, or all of the above. Oh my gosh, is this easy? There you go. Let's see how you do. Oh my gosh, what a surprise. Shouldn't be hard for you at all. I'll give you another 30 seconds. By the way, just so you know, the exam will be more or less timed. So we have, I think we're going to have, I guess you have 80 minutes. We'll have close to 80 questions on the exam. So the average of 1 minute per question is not bad. You're not timed on the, I mean, your per question answer is not timed on the exam, but just so you know, that will be on average. Okay, terrific. And yes, you're all doing very well. The correct answer is, in fact, D, all of the above. Remember that as a musical listener, you are implicitly able to recognize the intervals, right? Remember, I showed you that as long as you have names or songs that you can associate with minor thirds, major thirds, octaves, you know all that stuff. You have the ability to recognize musical styles, not by their names necessarily, but to be able to put them in order, or to understand their similarity based on historical proximity to each other, right? Baroque and classical is closer than Baroque and contemporary or neo-romantic, that sort of thing. And you're able to hear the similarities in the styles in that way. Yes, surprisingly enough, you are able to hear themes in this crazy type of atonal music that seems to really make no sense to us on kind of a simple listening. We are actually listening to even this kind of weird atonal music on a deep level. So the correct answer is all the above. Okay, great. You did pretty well. See if there's any more questions before we finish. How babies recognize their mother's voices. You'd ask this, and let me just say that is something we will absolutely be talking about when it comes to speech. But yes, it is through the womb. So yes, if that's what you mean by that. Owen has asked, in terms of implicit musical abilities, do certain people inherently have a more acute sense than others inherently? In other words, is there an explanation for having an ear for music? Yeah, I'm sure there is a genetic part of this. I certainly remember kids when I was young having what seemed to be a more innate ability to play music, to understand music, all that sort of thing. And certainly it does seem to run in families, right? You know, probably a lot of musicians or have heard of musicians who are the children of other musicians, right? That seems to be the case. That being said, those abilities, really most of them go beyond what I've talked about here, except for the expert musician stuff I talked about at the end. Everything that was just on that poll question is true of all of us if we're listeners. So yes, there is there is something to be said about this kind of inborn musical ear, that sort of thing. But you know what I'm trying to convey in that part of that chapter is we all have these abilities to some degree. Okay. Okay. Samson asked a question, and that's about the midterm, and I'm gonna ask you to look at that online about the midterm and look at the old lectures for that type of thing. I don't want to actually use up class time for that. Okay, thank you. So let's continue. What I'm going to do now is shift things to talk about smell. Okay, just a second. Let me just get set up here. Yes. Okay. So we're going to start talking about smell in a very interesting way. It's in fact the way the book starts the discussion. I chose it because I thought it would be kind of a surprising way to understand the importance of smell. Because it is one of the senses, and I'm guilty of this too. It's one of the senses we don't give enough attention to. And I have to say that when I started writing the book, I knew a lot about vision and a lot about hearing, something about touch, but I knew very little about smell. I had taught maybe one lecture in my regular perception course on smell each year and didn't know very much about it. And I started reading into it. And first of all, the research that's come out on smell over the last 15 years is absolutely amazing, and you're gonna find this really interesting. The sort of kind of unconscious skills that we have with smell are really, really impressive. But also, I started realizing that smell is more important to us as perceptual beings than we realize. And based on that awareness, I decided to go out and talk to somebody who had lost their sense of smell. Losing their sense of smell is called anosmia. I interviewed someone called Carl Vench. Here he is right here. Let me put him up there. There he is. Nice guy, and it was a perfect person to talk to because the way I found his name out is because I went on some discussion boards for people with anosmia, and he was very active in that. And it turns out he's a professor of perceptual psychology at a small college in the Midwest, and so he was the perfect person to talk to about that. He had been very aware of the research on anosmia, and he was able to kind of relate his own experience of anosmia with that research, so he was perfect. So the deal is with anosmia, it's much more prevalent than I think most of us realize. About 2 million people, when I wrote the book at least, about 2 million people can be considered anosmia, and that they don't have an ability to distinguish sense very well. Most of them go untreated. These are often discovered, as you can see on the slide here, they're often discovered not through not being aware of not being able to smell as much as not being able to taste, which you will learn about. Oh wait, you did learn, no, you'll learn about that on Monday's discussion section when you go through taste. You'll learn a little bit about that. Anyway, one of the interesting things that has appeared in the news recently is it turns out anosmia is one of the ways that they're able to diagnose the coronavirus. So it's not necessarily the most common symptom, but it is a symptom. So if one believes they've been exposed to the virus, if in fact they find out that if a doctor finds out that the patient has lost their sense of taste or sense of smell, then they will be very suspicious that in fact they have it. And in fact, I have a regular doctor's appointment I have to go to early next week, just a regular checkup. And what they asked me on the phone when I made the appointment was all these things about, whether I have a fever, whether I have a cough, whether I've been exposed to anybody with the virus, because they want to make sure nobody with the virus comes without them knowing it at the doctor's office. One of the questions they asked was, are you having any trouble smelling or tasting? It turns out that it is a known symptom, one of the known symptoms for the coronavirus, which is kind of surprising in a lot of ways. And it's unclear exactly what's going on with the coronavirus that's inducing anosmia. Most anosmia is not related to the coronavirus, and this is certainly not the case with Carl Vench, who I as I said, interviewed, in 2009. But Carl's problem is he developed what's called severe sinus polyps, and this is actually a relatively common reason that somebody ends up with anosmia, that they have little kind of growths, little non-malignant growths in their nasal cavities that actually block the air and block the kind of the olfactory sensory organs from actually getting the chemical scent that's coming into the nose. So it's a very common cause of anosmia. It's the most common one, as it turns out. And what happened with Carl is he first noticed it when food started losing its flavor, and then he talks about an instance where he was heating up a casserole in the microwave, and his wife came in and said, "Oh my gosh, that is the worst smelling stuff. There's something wrong with that casserole. It's probably been out for too long. It's not healthy. You should not eat that." And he wasn't aware of that smell being there. So he could have made himself pretty sick by eating this casserole. Another example he discusses is that he was doing some digging in his backyard and mistakenly hit a gas line, and was unaware that he did so until his daughter came out and said, "Hey, Dad, I smell gas. I don't think you should be digging anymore. Why don't you call the gas company?" As it turns out, he called the company, and they came out and said, "Oh yeah, you can't smell this. This is a very clear sign that you've hit a gas line." And he said, I can't smell it. At which point he went to the doctor, and the doctor told him that he had these polyps and he was anosmic. And so after finding this out, he realized that he, had to treat his anosmia as best he could. But until the treatment actually worked, he needed to set up things in his home to kind of help him with, kind of the dangerous aspects of anosmia. So, he put one of those sensors that detect a gas leak in his home. Whenever he cooked something that had been in the refrigerator a long time, he would either decide to throw it out and not cook it, or make sure somebody was around to tell him that it smelled rancid or something like that. He would have to be much more cautious. And then when it came to his loss of flavor in food, because that's one of the things anosmia does, if you can't smell your food, its flavor becomes much more diluted, becomes much more bland. If you're gonna have to find a way to compensate for that. So what he did is he found himself putting more salt on his food, putting more pepper or other types of spices in order to kind of recreate some flavor in the food that he wasn't able to taste very well. So as he was doing these precautions and compensations at home, he went through treatment. And the treatment sometimes involves different types of medicines to shrink the polyps, surgery to remove the polyps. But what's typical with anosmia, and it was certainly true of Carl's case, is that it took multiple rounds of treatment. And then these things would recur. I mean, he talked about these kind of situations where he'd have surgery, they remove the polyps, and after the surgery was complete, he'd start running into his kitchen every morning, and peanut butter is a very common smell that anosmics use to kind of test whether they can still smell. He'd run to the kitchen and open the peanut butter jar and smell, and what he'd notice every morning as he would try to smell the peanut butter, that it would become harder and harder to sniff. And he realized that, yes, in fact, the polyps probably had started growing back. So he'd have to have them treated again. And this was a very difficult thing for him to deal with. It's true of Carl. It's true of a majority of anosmics. They deal with a lot of depression. So, you ask an anosmic, what's it like losing a sense like this? And they'll say, listen, I know this is not like going blind. This is not like going deaf. It's not that kind of far reaching. It doesn't affect as many aspects of my life. But oh my gosh, I mean, yes, it's frustrating going through these recurrences, but even beyond that, I just generally feel more depressed than I ever have before anosmia came. And that is a very common sort of problem that comes with anosmia. It's depression. And there are support groups and doctors that treat anosmia are very aware of this and often put people on antidepressants and suggest they talk to a counselor and that sort of thing. And the sort of things you hear when people have anosmia is that they miss the flavor of food, which can be disappointing, and they miss the experience of being able to smell fresh cut grass and the leaves in the fall weather and that sort of thing, flowers, that sort of stuff. But what they really miss is the smell of other people. And that's especially true of new moms. So mothers of children, infants, toddlers, and even older children say that the thing they miss most is the smell of their children. If you've been around small children, you know that they, especially in infants, they smell pretty great. Their little heads, if you smell their little head, they smell, very kind of cuddly almost. It's a kind of a comforting feeling to smell an infant's head. And that's a very, if you read the kind of discussions online, that's a very common thing people say, is that the thing they miss most is the smell of people. And that's what Carl said, that he realized that the smell of other people was a much more kind of important part of his life than he ever realized before. Carl's a kind of interesting case. As I said, he's a perceptual psychologist. He's very aware of the research on this. He's very aware of the emotional kind of ramifications of anosmia. But because he's gone through rounds of treatment and recurrence, he is very aware that the thing he misses most when he's, going through a difficult period of anosmia is this problem of not being able to smell people. And I said, are you talking about the kind of, the natural body odor of people or the perfumes? And he goes, everything. Like when he is, treated and he's able to smell fairly well, he says he'll go to the shopping mall, and it kind of sounds weird, but I understand it. He'll find himself just like, going to the shopping mall, running errands, and walking behind people, men and women, and just enjoying, the colognes, the shampoos, the soaps, but also natural smells that come off of them. It says he kind of feels more connected in that way, and he never realized that before. But smell, possibly unconsciously, helps us feel connected to each other, which is I think a very, very interesting thing to learn. And it's from Carl's kind of introspective experience going through anosmia that he was able to become aware of that type of thing. Fortunately, as you'll read in the book, Carl is now pretty much cured. Last I talked to him, he's able to smell pretty well. He doesn't have to go through treatments. I guess he has to take anti-inflammatories regularly, and they do consistent monitoring of it, but he hasn't had a relapse to the point where he's had to have surgery or anything like that, which is a lucky thing. But it was really interesting talking to him, and really interesting to hear the sort of things that might lead to the depression, and that sort of stuff seems to, at least to a large degree, being unable to feel the connection one feels through smell. A lot of that is happening unconsciously, but we know through research it's an important part of our perceptual repertoire. So let's start talking about that. We know the secret smell of people. And what I mean by this is that we actually have an ability to recognize people and their own natural sense through smell. Not something you would think that you would naturally be able to do, but something that research suggests that we can do. So what I'm going to start talking about as I talk about smell, there's 2 chapters on smell. The first one really deals with examples and experiments where you are consciously asked to recognize different smells. And a lot of these experiments will come from methodologies that involve T-shirts and underarm swabs of people. So this is kind of like what we call scent signatures, the natural odors. So it sounds gross, but I've talked to people that do these experiments and have actually smelled the T-shirts that are used in these experiments. It's not nearly as gross as you think. What typically this involves is having individuals wear a T-shirt for 24 hours, so they'll wear it during the day and then sleep at it at night, and then put that T-shirt in a bag and send it to a laboratory, or go to the laboratory the next day and say, here's the T-shirt that now has my scent on it. They don't smell as bad as you imagine. It's not like the kind of very strong body odor you smell at the gym. It just smells like a worn T-shirt, more or less. And that's a person's natural odor. By the way, people are told not to put a deodorant on, not to bathe. But again, it's not nearly as bad as it sounds. The other way they do it sometimes is they take underarm swabs, because a lot of one's natural scent comes from the glands under the arms when it comes to especially one's own kind of natural odor. And what you find in these experiments is that, say you come back and you're one of the people that donated the T-shirt, but you also know some of the people who also donated the T-shirt. Sometimes this is done, in a dorm floor or something like that, or it's done with family members, that sort of thing. Is that when you then smell, say, 10 different T-shirts that have been worn by people, if some of those people, sorry, my slide's a little off here. The big story is here is you're going to be able to recognize a lot, but we're going to start with you when you were an infant. When you were newborn, in fact, there is evidence that you can recognize your mother's scent from it being provided for you. This is done with T-shirts. This is done with swabs that are taken from your mother. Okay. And how do you determine whether a newborn can recognize it? Well, it's one of these attention things, one of these attention experiments again. You can monitor the infant's, say, pacifier sucking response. This is a great way of finding out what infants are perceiving. And you find that if the infant is smelling a familiar scent, especially their mother's, they will start sucking the pacifier more quickly, which is really cool. It's a cool method for doing this, and it is a way of determining that infants can smell that. And what's considered to possibly go on here is that the newborn is recognizing their mother's scent through their mother's contribution to the amniotic fluid that they were floating in when they were in the womb. So the amniotic fluid is created through what the mother's biology and the infant's biology, what the infant secretes. And so it's going to have a distinctive kind of odor to it. And the infant can sniff the amniotic fluid and recognize their own embryonic fluid. And it's possible that they can therefore recognize their mom through the contribution of her biology to the amniotic fluid itself. Interestingly, mothers can recognize their child's amniotic fluid as well. So, after delivery, if a sample is taken of the amniotic fluid of one's own child versus another child versus say five others, the mother can recognize their own amniotic fluid and the child's amniotic fluid pretty well. The mom can also recognize their own child at birth through smell. So now a little swab is taken from the baby's underarm and presented to the mom, and say another 9 samples are taken from 9 other newborn children. The mom will say, oh yeah, that's my newborn baby right there. They're good at that. It takes dads a little longer to be able to recognize their children through smell. Moms recognize it right away, very likely because of their own contribution to the amniotic fluid and how that bears on the infant too. By the time you were 5, you could recognize your parents through smell, but you could also recognize, that's both parents at that point, you could also recognize your siblings' scent. So at 5, if you are given 10 t-shirts, a few of which are from your siblings, you would say, oh yeah, that's my brother. Oh yeah, that's my sister. And you could do it fairly well at just 5 years of age. That is something that you can do now. So if in fact you were given 10 t-shirts and some of them were from your adult siblings, you would be able to recognize their t-shirts. You'd be able to say, oh yeah, that's my brother, that's my sister, these other people are strangers, without much effort at all, which is pretty interesting. Continuing with this, parents, yes, can recognize their children's scent. As I said, the mother can recognize the newborn. Fathers take a little while longer to be able to perform that task. They take a little while longer to recognize their children's scent, but they can do it too. In all cases except for one, and this is interesting. If their children are identical twins, okay, they cannot distinguish them. So here I am, I'm a dad, pretend I have identical twin children, and say they're 5, 6 years old or something like that. I've got 10 t-shirts I need to smell. My job is to pick out which t-shirts belong to my twin boys, okay? And then say which boy is which out of those 10 t-shirts. First of all, I would go ahead, sniff the 10 t-shirts and say, oh yeah, no question, here's my boys right here. These 2 t-shirts belong to my boys. Say, okay, which one's Biff and which one's Bob? And I sniff them and say, well, I think this is Biff and this is Bob, but I'm not sure. In fact, they'd be at chance. They would be guessing. They are not able to distinguish their identical twin children. This is identical twins. Interestingly, neither are dogs, okay? So you know about scent tracking in dogs. You've seen this, portrayed on detective shows, police shows, that sort of thing, where dogs can, be given a t-shirt and say, okay, go get him, Rover, go get the criminal that's trying to escape us. If in fact, and they're good at, dogs can do this. Dogs can be trained to do this pretty well. They can find somebody based on their smell. But if they're identical twins, they have the same problem that parents have. They can't make that distinction. And that's going to be an important clue, because it's going to tell us something about what we're smelling when we're able to recognize somebody based on their scent. What seems clear here is there's going to be an important genetic component of scent signatures. An important genetic component in that if the genetic makeup of 2 individuals is the same as they are in identical twins, then we're not going to be able to distinguish them. And it's one of the few cases where parents cannot completely identify which specific child has donated a t-shirt, has provided the scent to a t-shirt. Okay, it's interesting. Other quick bits of information. Parents recognize their stepchildren's scent less well than they recognize their own children's scent, even if the extent of time is nearly equal. Okay, so the question here is, if there's a genetic component that one is smelling in the scent signature, to what degree are we able to do that just from kind of experience with that smell versus something else. And I think this finding that parents, even if they've lived with their stepchildren for nearly as long or as long as they've lived with their biological children, right? So, there's certainly cases where, remarried parents are living with their stepchildren longer than they're living with their natural child because it's a second marriage, they're having a natural child later. Even though they've been exposed to their stepchildren for a longer period of time, they'll be able to recognize their own children better through scent, which is interesting. Okay, and the same thing's also true of siblings, right? It's also true of siblings. They can recognize their own biological siblings better than their step siblings' scent, which I think also says something about this kind of inherent kind of genetic component that's involved in recognizing people through scent, which we're going to see, I think, has strong support in just a second. But that's what we're kind of working up towards here, is that we're trying to understand what the basis of scent recognition is. Okay. One idea is maybe we're able to recognize our biological relatives, our children, our parents, our siblings, because of the genetic makeup they have is, connected to our own, which could then make their scent in some ways similar to our own scent. Now, we might not be aware that our siblings smell like us, right? But at kind of a more implicit, unconscious level, it might be the basis of how we're able to recognize our biological siblings more easily, because in fact, their scent is, kind of more similar to our own scent, and that's how it's actually being done. Okay. Let's take a little break here. It looks like there's some questions. There always are when we talk about scent, and I like that. So yes, great. Okay, so James asks, can polyps be surgically removed? Absolutely, they do. They can be removed with Carl Winch, and with a lot of people who've had anosmia, though, these polyps do grow back. So what has to be done is some sort of medicine has to be repeatedly applied so they don't grow back, or some type of antibiotic has to be used. But yes, at least initially they can grow back, and that can be the basis of the recurrence of anosmia. Aida says, since coronavirus has the same symptoms as anosmia, how would an anosmic patient know how to get by with not able to smell if Sheria catches the corona? The smell of recognizing people only with familiar people. Yes, okay. So I think she's asking two questions here. So the coronavirus, when it is treated and cured, anosmia stops. So people do regain their sense of smell. So that would be a pretty clear indication that the anosmia had a basis in the virus and not something else like polyps. But it is an interesting thing that in fact, it is one of the symptoms now of coronavirus. And the other question she asked is smell of recognizing people only with familiar people. Well, you have to certainly be familiarized with the person. I think probably what you're asking there is how familiar do we have to be in order to recognize a person through smell? And can you, for example, be kind of familiarized with a smell in an experiment, a person in an experiment, across an experiment that lasts for an hour, and then recognize their smell? Much less well, as it turns out. But you can recognize people that are not related to you, like your significant other, through smell. As you'll see on the next slide, it's going to be much less consistent than recognizing your biological relatives, which is interesting. Jessica? Does the stepchildren thing apply to adopted kids as well? Absolutely. So this biological component does seem to provide a piece of the basis, a chunk of the basis of how we're able to recognize children by smell. However, as you'll see, we can still recognize our adopted children. We can recognize our stepchildren. We can recognize our friends based on smell, just nowhere near as well as we can recognize our biological relatives, which is interesting. What about babies to stepfathers? Are babies able to recognize their scent? That's a good question. I don't know that much about baby sensitivity. I don't know how thoroughly baby sensitivity to step parents have been tested. It's like, I really don't know the answer to that. I imagine that that is something that has been asked. It's maybe something you could look up fairly easily. I think these has there half siblings. Yes, there has been research done on half siblings, and again, it's a consistent sort of finding. If there's a biological connection, it provides an advantage to being able to recognize somebody through scent. Basically, that's what you find. Is scent recognition the same as, yeah? Okay, I think I kind of answered that. Okay, what about people's houses? That's a good question. So, you know, sometimes depending on a family's, you know, dinner preferences, cooking preferences, you can walk into a house and smell different things. Does that have a bearing on one's natural scent? And what I'll say here at this point is not directly. However, there is, and you read in the book, I think I know I mentioned this in the book. I don't remember if I actually mentioned this in the lecture, but one's own eating habits does have a bearing on how one's t-shirt would smell. It's not part of the genetic scent signature. So if you change your eating habits, if you move from a meat eater to a vegetarian diet, you do smell different, which is interesting, but it doesn't affect the biological, the kind of genetic component of the signature. So that part can change. It's a very good question. Does knowing someone's smell, Yana, does knowing somebody's smell help in hiding seek? Who knows? It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe, you know, I think one of the things I learned when I was going through this literature is that we're using smell much more than we realize, and maybe that's one of the examples where we do. I don't know. I don't know if anyone's ever actually looked at that. Can someone recognize their twin through smell? Yes, somebody can recognize their sibling that's a twin versus another sibling through smell. Absolutely. Okay, you know, I'm sorry, so Alan missed a bunch of the material. I'm sorry, Alan. I don't want to review all that stuff now. I'm sorry about your lag. The recording, I'll assure you, though, the recording's working great right now. So I just ask you to go back and look at that recording. Okay, good. Isn't this fun? You know, I was going to do a little kind of, you know, fun thing to break up the lecture today, but I don't know. I think you guys are attentive enough. It seems like you're really engaged, so I'm not going to do that. It will allow me to go through more material. So, so no silly stuff right now. Let's instead go through more sense stuff. I think you're finding this interesting, so that's great. So, okay, let me get rid of chat and go back to screen share. Oops, there we go. Make me big, and cool. Okay, this is where things I think get really interesting. All that, you know, don't get me wrong, all that stuff on the previous slide I think was interesting, but now we're getting to actually the reason or the basis for this, for why we can recognize people through their scent. A couple of, you know, kind of bits of information to kind of move towards that. First of all, yes, the questions came up in the last set about recognizing the scent of familiar non-relatives. And yes, we can. As I said, you can recognize your romantic partners. You can recognize your friends through scent. I imagine if you've been living in the dorm until we all had to go home, that the people on your floor in the dorm, at least the people that you're friends with, that you know, you spend a lot of time with, you would probably be able to recognize their t-shirts based on their smell. Certainly you're able to recognize your romantic partners based on their smell. But as I've suggested, you're still better at recognizing relatives, even if you haven't seen those relatives in a long time. So certainly I spent a lot more time in the last 20 years with my wife than I have with my brother, because he lives in a different town. But the research suggests that I would be able to recognize my brother's t-shirt, his own natural odor, better than I'd be able to recognize my wife's, which is really interesting because, you know, the amount of time I've spent with my wife is so much greater than the amount of time I spent with my brother over the last 20 years. But there's something there. There's something in my brother's sense signature that allows me to spontaneously recognize it that is different from my wife, who doesn't have this, obviously, a related genetic makeup. So let's get to this now. What, in fact, are we smelling? What composes the scent signature? And what's considered to be involved here is a part of our genome, a part of our genetic makeup. It's going to be a technical term. That's okay. Something you need to learn. It's something called the major histocompatibility complex, or the MHC. And what that is it's a part of our genome that's very dense. Major histocompatibility complex. I guess it's the kind of most technical term we've had in class so far. It's, you know, I don't really worry too much about. You should, you know, remember the term, but it's okay. I don't want to intimidate you with the term by any means. Just know it's a part of the genome that's very, very dense, and it's known to code for things like our immune system, our autoimmune system. You're going to find some really interesting things that occur here with regard to immune systems, autoimmune systems, and how we select mates and things like that. But, you know, depending on how, you know, strong your immune system is, and we know, you know, some of us seem to have, you know, more robust immune systems than others. You know, some of us have autoimmune issues, that sort of thing. That part of the genome is thought to code for these traits, okay? It is also thought that this is the part of the genome that codes for the scent signature, that codes for our natural odor, okay? Which is really interesting. It's suggesting here that what our scent signature is informing people about is potentially the makeup of our immune system. This is cool. This is really, really cool. This is where I think things get kind of almost science fiction-y or something like that, but it is grounded in science, I promise. So when we smell a scent signature, we are smelling something about the genetic makeup of somebody. Particularly what we are smelling is the genetic makeup as it relates to their immune system. Okay? It does certainly allow us to recognize our relatives kind of as, you know, a good thing. That's possibly something that's important. But it also allows us to recognize people who are potentially compatible with us and our immune systems. Okay, so let's now talk about a different type of experiment. It's a t-shirt experiment still, but in this case, what you're going to be asked to do is to smell 10 t-shirts of strangers of the opposite gender. So I don't know the details on whether this works with same gender couples, but initially this research had been done with mostly women as the subjects, smelling men's t-shirts and being asked, out of these 10 men's t-shirts, which are the most attractive scents to you? These are 10 men's t-shirts that had been worn by the men for 24 hours. The men did not put on deodorant or soap or anything like that, okay? And the women are smelling the t-shirts and saying, I take or leave these, but boy, this t-shirt, this is a nice smelling guy right here, okay? Without knowing them, without ever having met them or anything like that, okay? As it turns out, there's a lot of things that are going to be playing a role in one's preference for the potential romantic potential of a person's smell. Lots of things that we'll talk about later. But one of the things that interestingly goes into that is the genetic makeup of that person. Because, so this is what I mean by socio-sexual influences. The preference of a woman for that man's t-shirt, okay, is going to be based on how their own immune system is kind of complementary to the immune system of the men whose smell they like. Let me say that again. Here I am. I'm a woman in this experiment. I smell this one man's t-shirt and I said, oh, hubba hubba. That's a nice smelling guy. All right. And what the scientists then do is they take kind of genetic tests through saliva of the subjects, MHC, the major histocompatibility complex, and the guy's major histocompatibility complex. And they find that if the immune systems of these two people are complementary to each other, it seems to be one of the reasons that a woman will find a man's scent attractive. It's a complicated thing, I understand, but it's so cool, right? So here I am, a woman smelling a man's t-shirt. My immune system will have a structure, genetically speaking, that is a good complement to that man's genetic immune system. So if in fact we get married, okay, have children, we'll have the immune system influences of two people who complement each other and have children who have really nice, strong immune systems. Okay? That's what I mean by a complementary immune system. So, I like to do this with my fingers. Here's my immune system, here's my wife's immune system. And the way these fit together is they kind of complement to each other. So if my genetic immune system is good for warding off certain types of bacteria, viruses, that sort of thing, and my wife has another set of immune system traits, when we get together, we have children that have really nice, strong immune systems. When you find a person's scent attractive, you are in a way smelling how their immune system is compatible with your own. That's pretty darn cool. And that's been something that's kind of been consistently shown to some degree when it comes to asking women to find scents they find attractive out of a set of men's t-shirts. It does not seem to be as consistent, so I know that I'm going to get questions about this, just anticipate this. It does not seem to be as consistent when asking men to smell women's t-shirts, okay, which is interesting. It seems women might be more sensitive to this type of thing, right? And I don't know the research on same-sex mates. Okay, I don't know the research on that, whether if you're in a same-sex if you prefer the same sex, if in fact you'll still find t-shirts of a person who has that genetic complementarity more attractive. I don't know that, actually. I do get questions of that. I'll try to look that up. When I wrote the book, certainly there wasn't research on that at the time. But maybe now there is. I'd be very interested to see if that's the case. Okay, the other question I often get at this point is that people will say, well, okay, that's kind of cool, but we wear colognes, we wear shampoos, okay? We don't, we wear things that hide our natural scents. So is this in fact defeating that in a way? And here's a couple of things to say about that. First of all, the colognes we wear, the shampoos we wear, the soaps we wear, do to some degree mask those scents, but not completely. Even if if you smell a t-shirt and it smells like a cologne, say the person did not stop wearing cologne over that 24-hour period, boy, this just smells like a cologne. Even though that might be the most consciously striking smell of that t-shirt, there still will be some natural scent information coming through. And another aspect of this I think is really interesting. There's evidence that the smells that we like to use for our own bodies, the smells we choose for colognes, for perfumes, for shampoos, for soaps, the smells that we choose are actually smells that depend on our own scent signatures. And maybe you've noticed this before if you've spent a lot of time shopping for colognes or perfumes at the department store, the perfume store, that some smells smell good on your body and some smells don't smell good on your body. You could say, oh boy, I really like how my friend smells. The perfume she's wearing just smells, great. I'm going to go buy that perfume too. And you go to the store and you put it on yourself. You say, oh boy, it does not smell as good on me as it does on her. I'm going to try a different perfume. And then you'll find one that smells great on you, but probably doesn't smell that good on her. And what's going on there is just the way that the perfume is interacting with your natural scent signature, which of course is based on this MHC part of your genome, which of course in turn is signaling something about your immune and autoimmune system. Okay. Let me stop here and see. I just have a few minutes, I understand, but let's stop here and see if we have questions I can answer just over a minute. Okay, some people are just saying goodbye, goodbye. I'm sorry. We can ask more questions about this next class if you want. There's no problem, but I have a minute if you want to ask any really quick questions because I know people find this really, really interesting. That's okay. Nope, people are saying goodbye. Okay, no problem. We can answer these questions more next class. I think you'll find our continued discussion of scent really, really interesting. Okay, bye everybody.